Hello, and welcome to Ghostly Ancestors. I am your host, Jonathan Marks, and this is a paper for a session called Disturbing the Ghosts, presented at the 2025 meetings of the American Anthropological Association. We talk about ancestors in three ways in anthropology. The first way is, of course, our intellectual predecessors, our own ancestors in our identities as anthropologists. The second way is through the culturally relative study of kinship, and the ways in which groups of people in all times and places have made sense of their own position in the social world in relation to people older than themselves or no longer alive. And the third way is in our scientific analysis and consequent narratives about our biological ancestors of hundreds of thousands of years ago. I'm interested in the next few minutes in discussing number 3, subsumed by number 2, with a lot of reference to number 1. More generally, I'm interested in making anthropological sense of biological anthropology, which has to tread a fine line between the relativism of cultural knowledge and the absolutism of science education. So let me begin with an intellectual ancestor, mammalian paleontologist George Gaylord Simpson. In 1945, Simpson was surveying the class Mammalia and rendering sage taxonomic judgments upon it. But the closer he got to people, the screwier the literature became. The peculiar fascination of the primates, he wrote, and their publicity value have almost taken the order out of the hands of sober and conservative mammalogists and have kept and do keep its taxonomy in a turmoil. Moreover, even mammalogists who might be entirely conservative in dealing, say, with rats, are likely to lose a sense of perspective when they come to the primates, and many studies of this order are covertly or overtly emotional. And Simpson had an idea about why this situation had arisen. It wasn't being done by mammalian taxonomists. It was being done by people with training in medical anatomy and physical anthropology. A major reason for this confusion is that much of the work on primates has been done by students who had no experience in taxonomy and who were completely incompetent to enter this field, however competent they may have been in other respects. Nowadays, primate taxonomy has been fundamentally altered by the value placed on conservation issues, which was not the case some decades ago, and which is behind the explosion of recognized primate species from about 170 of them in the 1980s to well over 500 now. But I digress. Even back in 1945, Simpson recognized that as soon as we got to our own direct ancestors, things got even screwier. He even threw up his hands in mock indignation and suggested that perhaps it would be better for the zoological taxonomist to set apart the family Hominidae and to exclude its nomenclature and classification from their studies. The problem, as Simpson saw it, was a straightforward one. Hominids are primates, and primates are mammals. Therefore, an expert in mammalian species should be able to make sense of the literature on hominid species. And yet, strangely, he couldn't. The assumption Simpson was working under, quite reasonably, is that there is an underlying correct classification of the living and dead species, and the job of a good taxonomist is to produce it. If you can't come up with it, it's because you're not a good enough biological taxonomist. The fossil record is made up of species, which are the units that macroevolutionary nature comes in, and it's just as true for equids as for hominids. So, why should it be straightforward to bring taxonomic order to the Equidae, a book that Simpson wrote in 1951, and not for the Hominidae? What is wrong with the hominids? Simpson returned to the hominids at the 1962 Wenner-Gren Conference called Classification and Human Evolution, which Sherry Washburn had organized for some inexplicable reason. And at the Conference of Alpha Males, Simpson got into it with his friend and fellow alpha, Louis Leakey. The published version of Leakey's comments include the following. Since the names which we apply at any and every level in the taxonomic sequence are inevitably arbitrary and artificial, it does not, I believe, matter what we decide to do, provided only that the majority of those who are concerned in the classification at any given time are agreed as to how they will use the classification system that is set up, and provided they are clear as to what they mean by the different names that are applied. Simpson found these comments particularly vexing, since he had just published a book called Principles of Animal Taxonomy. And Leakey seemed to be implying that there were no such principles, or at least none that we needed to bother with. Simpson's published conference paper emphasizes chaos. It is notorious that hominid nomenclature particularly has become chaotic. It's ironical that some of those who have complained of the chaos have been leading contributors to it. Oh, snap! And then more broadly, many fossil hominids have been described and named by workers with no other experience in taxonomy. They have inevitably lacked the sense of balance and the interpretive skill of zoologists who have worked extensively on larger groups of animals. It must, however, be sadly noted that even broadly equipped zoologists often seem to lose their judgment if they work on hominids. Here, factors of prestige, of personal involvement, of emotional investment rarely fail to affect the fully human scientist, although they hardly trouble the workers on, say, angleworms or dung beetles. Well, that was then and this is now, and fortunately, all of those problems have now been solved. Well, we've got Homo sapiens, which is pretty uncontroversial except in translation. And then a lot of things that may or may not be species, depending upon who you read and when you read them. And this is an incomplete list. Anyone on today's panel can come up with additional names that are out there, but they don't accept as a real species. Now, there have been some advances in anthropological taxonomy over the last few decades, notably in the area of modern human diversity. In 1962, you've got Bernard Campbell doing his Linnaean thing on the human species in the leading scientific journal in the world, and officially saying that there are 6 taxonomic subspecies of extant Homo sapiens, in a paper that has fallen into obscurity, primarily because it came out the same year as Frank Livingstone's radical and paradigmatic declaration that in our species, as in some others, there are no races, there are only clines. And that is, at least in part, how we teach about human variation in anthropology today. Human races are not fundamentally biological categories. They are cultural categories that sometimes correlate to varying degrees with biology. Now, of course, that opens up 2 subsequent humanistic questions. First, if there aren't formal categories of humans below the species level, Linnaeus actually called them varieties because the word subspecies had not yet been coined, then why did scientists say there were for 2 centuries? We expect science to be right, and when it's wrong, that's interesting. It's a man bites dog story, so to speak. And second, if human variation is not patterned racially, and therefore human variation and race are different things, and we are studying human variation scientifically, then what is race? Now, there is an extensive and diverse scholarly literature addressing those questions, which hasn't been banned yet, but which leads to the second part of my paper, namely that if we can conceptualize and discuss human variation non-taxonomically, because imposing formal biological taxonomy on human variation simply confuses it, then is it different for human ancestry? Trees are easier to model and to taxonomize, but have long been recognized to be a poor metaphor for human prehistory, compared to a trellis, capillary system, or a braided stream, increasingly the metaphor of choice, per our friend Professor Rebecca Ackerman of the University of Cape Town. Dividing living organisms into discrete formal categories is, of course, a scientific practice we inherited from 18th century biologists, quite independently of both evolutionary theory and the fossil record. And that is the source of a lot of taxonomic controversy. Biological classification was simply a lot easier before evolution and fossils. But again, I digress. As far as we know, chimpanzees do not contemplate their ancestry or revere their ancestors. This is presumably because they don't have much in the way of postmenopausal grandmothers on the one hand, or big brains on the other. After all, any cogitating hominin with a theory of mind can presumably link themselves, their mother, and their grandmother into a lineage, and begin to imagine Nana's Nana. I don't think there's much contention over the recognition that ancestry is symbolically important everywhere, in different ways. Within our own mythical corpus, we recall how the Japanese in the late 1930s were so anxious to control, own, or even destroy the ancestors of the Chinese that special precautions needed to be taken to protect the Peking man fossils from them. No such precautions were thought necessary to protect European fossil hominins from the Nazis. Ancestors are special, differently special to different peoples, and some ancestors are more special than others. When we talk about human variation and human ancestry, we are in fact talking about relatives and ancestors, which is an anthropological topic, and in fact arguably the oldest research question in the field of anthropology. And you can't talk about relatives and ancestors objectively or non-culturally. At least nobody ever has yet. Today we have genetics, ecology, phylogeny, and fossils to consider and to weigh against each other as we try to jerry-rig an 18th century view of nature to accommodate 21st century science. Which brings us back to the issue of formally named species within what many scholars are now calling a structured metapopulation of Homo sapiens and their extinct relatives and ancestors. I would ask, what is the value added for this proliferation of species names? But I hate rhetorical questions, so I'll tell you, because it's not news. Most, if not all, of the speakers in this session have written about it in one forum or another. In the first place, science prioritizes firstness, and so it's better to find the first A than to find the second B. Better for the discoverer and for the discoverer's sponsors. In the second place, having many species democratizes the research process, because there are now so many more key specimens, museums, and curators. And third, having many species reinforces a particular narrative of human evolution. moving from one of cohesion and survival, shall we say the Loring Brace model, to one of diversity and extinction, shall we say the Steve Gould model. But of course they both presuppose that human ancestry is populated by units of nature equivalent to 18th century classificatory categories, ultimately having something to do with reproductive compatibility, genetic descent, and ecological adaptation. And perhaps it is. But what else might it be populated by, which resemble Linnaean species but are actually, for lack of a better term, merely different samples of the hominin anatomy pool? And the answer is human prehistory is populated by ancestors, and ancestors are symbolically special. This isn't rocket science. Seriously. It's reflexive anthropological science. We are not humans studying rockets, we are humans studying humans. And to pretend that we aren't is science fiction, not science. Now, as it happens, ancestors are something that anthropology knows a little bit about. After all, in the history of anthropology, kinship and evolution were intimately bound together until separated from one another by the British functionalists. So what can we say about human ancestors that chimpanzees can't say about their ancestors, if they could say anything, which of course they can't? Or to put it another way, what are the attributes of your ancestors? First, they are interesting. As far as we can tell, apes neither know nor care about their ancestors, aside from a juvenile grieving for a dead mother. But it's a fairly universal consideration among humans. Your ancestors are a subject of interest, and I'm sure I don't need to tell you what humans do when they find a subject interesting. They tell stories about it. Second, your ancestors are unique, and those ancestors form a personal constellation of people in your past, except for those of your siblings who are the only ones who have the same ancestors as you. Your ancestors are almost as unique as your social security number, which of course also helps to establish your identity in a society. A subset of those ancestors are shared by your relatives and literally define them as your relatives. And by the way, this is a human genetics kinship chart because this is a bioanthro session. Third, your ancestors are powerful. Why? Because they're dead. You can worship them, ask them for guidance, become possessed by them, and engage with them in all sorts of imaginative cultural ways, all of which lie outside the mental range of ape thoughts, as far as we can tell. And fourth, your ancestors are part of you. It may be true spiritually, but it's definitely true genetically. After all, about 1/8 of the DNA in your cells is perfectly identical to that of your great-grandfather Charles Manson. But be that as it may, that's something no chimp has ever had to worry about. So I will put two final thoughts out there for you. First, if that is indeed a fairly accurate generalization about the symbolic importance of ancestors across human societies, then how might it apply to our scientific, biological, phylogenetic ancestors? And second, since you already know that I hate rhetorical questions, I'll answer it for you. The anthropological data indicate that your ancestors are interesting, unique, powerful, and part of you. That seems to be what human ancestors are. On the other hand, your ancestors might be ecologically and reproductively distinct phylogenetic lineages. That is what the taxonomic biological haggling is over, what those ancestors might be. But what probably is, what we know, is science, and what might be is science fiction. The distinction is critical and frequently overlooked. That is why it is an unresolved issue of biology, because it might only make sense as an anthropological issue, a biological anthropological issue.